Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. First of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Philip Eidson, and I'm the Managing Director here at Art of Procurement. And I'm joined on screen by my co-founder, Kelly Barner. So welcome, and thank you for joining me, Kelly.
Absolutely, and we're glad everybody's with us live today for an afternoon session. Usually we're in the morning Eastern.
And we're going to be tag teaming the questions as we go through the conversation. Today's, if you're kind of unfamiliar with an AOP Live and the format of an AOP Live, it is all about the conversation. We have one single slide, which is just a poll finding that we want to share and use to kind of stimulate some discussion around it. Apart from that, it's all conversation with our guests. Now, we would invite you as we go throughout the webinar today to, of course, add your questions, add your comments. You can do that in the sidebar within this platform. You can see the chat box, I'm sure, at the side of you, and there's also a Q&A tab as well. Questions you can pop in the Q&A tab, but also don't be shy to just pop them in the chat, and Kelly and I will be keeping an eye on those as well, and we will get to as many as we possibly can throughout the conversation, which I know is action-packed today. We've got an awful lot to talk about.
Yes, we do. I'm going to have to use that fast talking for us to get through it all.
So the topic today is rising to the challenge, driving procurement excellence in 2023. So how is procurement navigating challenges like the economy, ESG, supply disruptions, shifting workforce dynamics, regulatory requirements, and generative AI? There's a lot that's being thrown at us at the moment. So KPMG, they recently conducted a survey of 400 global procurement leaders, capturing insights on the current challenges, goals, priorities, and outlook. So we're going to be talking in a little bit more detail, sharing the findings and some of the considerations behind those findings. We're going to be joined, we're going to pull them on stage in just a moment here by Dipan Karumsi, who is the Principal of Procurement and Outsourcing Advisory Practice Leader at KPMG US, and Len Prokopets, who's also Managing Director of Procurement and Outsourcing Advisory at KPMG here in the US. So with that said, let's bring Dipan and Len into the conversation. Hey Dipan, hey Len, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Now, I always start these conversations with the same question. So I'm going to do that, and I will ask you first, Dipan. The question I always ask, and it's really just to give some context into your background, is did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Yeah, I think for me, procurement found me. You know, I was really working in more of the traditional supply chain type areas. Long time consulting for sure, but as I got into supply chain a little bit more, it was an interesting niche area at that time that I thought was quite interesting and that not many people had kind of focused their careers on. So with a little bit of testing and trying out things, that's where I kind of focused on, and I've stuck with it for the last 20 years. So it's been great.
And Len, how about you? How did you find yourself in procurement?
Yeah, I would say probably both. I found procurement and it found me. Actually, I was working with Dipan on supply chain, supplier collaboration, some customer collaboration topics. And then I realized chief procurement officers had a whole bunch of other interesting challenges to wrestle with. So I got immersed.
And I think there's a lot of commonalities between supply chain and procurement as well, where we may talk about them as being separate functions, but really a lot of the things we do are very similar, you know, in both of the verticals. So I'm sure a lot of those experiences carried through into procurement. So the first question I want to ask today, Dipan, I'm going to ask this of you. We talked in the intro a little bit about, we're going to be talking about some research that KPMG has done. And so I just wonder if you could share a little bit more about the research study that we're going to be discussing today.
Absolutely. So what we wanted to do is really take a pulse on the procurement market, right? So we polled 400 folks, as you kind of mentioned, at the VP, SVP, and C levels globally across all industries. And so we got a really nice kind of subset from each of those different groups to better understand the challenges that they're facing today, the types of things that they're focusing on as they come into the next year and beyond, and even learn a little bit about some of the challenges they may have faced over the last year or two and what they're doing about it. So today, you know, that report's going to come out by the end of the year. And so everybody here will get an email with a link of that report. But today we're going to talk about some of the preliminary findings and some of the things that we find interesting.
Okay, great. A sneak preview. We all like sneak previews.
Exactly.
So we actually did a little bit of not quite as detailed research as you have done, but we posted a LinkedIn poll coming up into the conversation today with a question that I'm just going to share the question and the answer for. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion around whether this is in line with what you were seeing in the research that you've done. Now, the question, I'm going to read it out for anybody who's not able to watch and is just listening to this later. The question was, which of the following supply challenges has created the greatest opportunity for procurement in the last few years? The answers in order of popularity of result was top was an uncertain economy at 59%. Second was shifting workforce dynamics at 26%. Third was corporate ESG targets at 9%. And fourth was new regulatory requirements at 7%. Dipan, is this surprising to you, or is this in line with what you are seeing out in the market?
No, definitely not. I mean, I think everybody, whether it be how your budgets are being impacted, whether it be what savings you're going to be able to produce next year, whether it be what demand you're going to have for some of the products and services, which are going to translate to some of the procurement priorities, has been really focused around the economy for our clients as well. And so not surprising to kind of see that at the top. Hopefully, as we get into next year and beyond, maybe we see that trail off a little bit into some other priority areas, but let's see.
Len, any surprises from your perspective?
I would say this is actually quite consistent, and this is something that we see day in and day out with our clients. Obviously, the macroeconomic environment has just put a huge strain on businesses in all industries, and procurement is kind of on the front lines having to deal with these issues. So really, there hasn't been a business as usual for the last couple of years, and procurement is in kind of a reactive mode dealing with some of these challenges. We got some data back from respondents around just the threats that they're seeing and that they're anticipating. And the top three that we heard were rising material and freight costs, obviously something that they've wrestled with for the last couple of years, but this is still out there. Upstream supply disruption and material shortages, and upstream cybersecurity exposures.
Interesting.
So I would say the supply disruption and material shortages was probably number one on the list for a little while for the last couple of years as organizations just struggle to get materials in the door, but it's still on the list.
Yeah, and it's interesting how those are our bread and butter when you think about the procurement value proposition. And I think part of the challenge is how do we move out of being seen as a trusted advisor beyond those areas that when you're at that point in the business cycle, procurement is it creates an opportunity for procurement versus when we're in more of a growth and perhaps business as usual. Maybe we're never going to have business as usual again. I guess time will tell. Yeah.
Let's hope we do go back to normal.
Yeah. Kelly.
Len, to ask you sort of a follow-up on what we were talking about, you've talked about, I hear you say roadblocks, I hear you say struggles, I hear you say, right, the challenges, but each one of those, especially when there's uncertainty, it does create an opportunity for procurement and supply chain to add additional value. There's some fatigue associated with the window of time we've been through, but do you feel like procurement has done a good job of looking for and whenever possible, leveraging those opportunities that have presented themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say remarkably, largely procurement has weathered the storm in certainly most of our clients and the organizations that responded to our survey. It's quite interesting, despite all these challenges, all this flux in the broader environment, the current cost reduction levels that organizations reported in our study were about 4.6%, which is, I would say, historically quite healthy. We also heard, we asked questions around the maturity of all the different capabilities that procurement has to have. And what we heard was that most organizations feel that they have quite mature capabilities, and particularly in strategic sourcing, value generation areas, regulatory compliance, and procurement operations. So clearly that there's some comfort level there. What really does highlight a cause for concern, though, is that a very small minority of the respondents, so 25%, believe that they would get a high rating for the service that procurement provides to their stakeholders. And so clearly there's some room for improvement. We know about this anecdotally from our clients where procurement is always sort of out there putting out fires, trying to deal with supply issues, and clearly some of those challenges are things that the stakeholders perceive as issues.
Yeah. And Dipan, if I can pull you into this conversation as well. So we've already heard from both of you about some of the top priorities, some of the things externally that procurement has needed to dedicate energy and attention to, but then maybe some remaining opportunity internally. Have we been in a situation where maybe there's been some competition or some friction between externally driven objectives for procurement and internally driven things around user experience or improved solutions? What were maybe some of the things that you learned from your research about procurement's top objectives and how that's aligning with our priorities?
Yeah, I mean, externally, Len kind of mentioned supplier costs, rising inflation, economic environment. A lot of those things kind of came in, and they were pretty clear. Internally, there was a lot around just outdated systems and infrastructure. It's surprising. We've done a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years of modernizing kind of the platforms and really providing something nice to our stakeholders that's easy to use and self-service oriented. But that seemed like a fairly big pain point still. So there's still that work that needs to be done. And so getting that true integration across all the platforms internally is a big source of getting insights. And when you don't have that, we're seeing through the results that they're seeing those pain points will come out. Not being able to provide those insights, I think, is a challenge, and it doesn't allow them to kind of showcase the value that procurement can bring to the table. So there's a little bit of focus there. Other things we heard were that demand management is a big focus area right now. We wouldn't have seen that perhaps a couple of years ago, but companies are purchasing things like software at record pace still, and it's important to be able to manage the demand on the licenses and what you're actually going to need versus what you're paying for. What we saw with a lot of our clients who have actually implemented nice operational systems in the last couple of years, they changed their approval workflows so that they could either reduce the approval limits or give more visibility to senior executives around the purchases that are happening. And so that allowed them to kind of reduce that demand just by routing transactions to certain places. So having some of those controls in place internally was really important for them, and they're still looking to do some of that stuff.
Interesting. And that's actually a great transition because, Phil, I think next we're looking at some of those executive perspectives.
Yeah, and actually, just before we do, Len, I want to jump on something you said around the 25%. So if I'm understanding it correctly, 25% of procurement leaders believe that they're not well perceived by the rest of the business. Is that right?
I think it's close. So to 25. Our respondents basically rated the level of satisfaction that they believe the broader organization has with the procurement services. And basically the respondents are saying that only 25% of them see themselves rated as providing high service.
So there's kind of a lack of self-confidence.
Yeah,
perhaps, but it also speaks somewhat to I think just the friction that has been out there that procurement has had to deal with, and it's been difficult to provide high service in an environment where your suppliers can't ship or your suppliers don't have the labor and resources to serve you on time.
And I think, Len, on top of that, the remit of procurement continues to change, right? I mean, historically, it was just more around strategic sourcing, supplier management. Now, supplier risk management has become a key component of it, doing advanced analytics, identifying what predictive analytics looks like in terms of where we're going to go next year, really managing master data around catalog content and the things to tie everything together. So there are a number of things that have been thrown to procurement as well, which they're having to spread their, tight time across.
So I think it segues interestingly into a question. Like, we constantly hear about CEOs not necessarily understanding the procurement value proposition. Now, Dipan, is that something, do you see that from the client base that you work across or from the procurement leaders that you work across, that there is that gap of perception or perhaps relationship between procurement and the CPO and then the office of the CEO?
Yeah, procurement's been doing a good job of kind of working themselves to a seat at the table for many, many years now. And they've done a nice job kind of showcasing some of that value. But we still find, I think it was 42% believe that C-suite leaders have a high degree of understanding of the procurement function. And a little bit of that might be because there's the fact that procurement wears multiple hats. The CEO might not be aware of all of the different things that procurement is responsible for. There might not be as strong of an alignment between procurement and supply chain, or procurement and AP, for example, that doesn't really kind of clearly delineate what procurement should be working on. So that could be part of the challenge. And it just could be challenges in showing the value that procurement's bringing to the table. You know, historically, cost savings around strategic sourcing, that's an easy number to put on the board and to show. But what about the value around managing risks and mitigating those before issues happen around supplier failures? You know, what about some of the other things that you could bring to the table around cost avoidance or demand management, and showcasing that value and having CEOs be bought in to that as a real value driver and a bottom line impact item? So I think there's a number of challenges that we still face, and it's a communication challenge that we're going to have to continue to work on. Yeah,
isn't it interesting when you talk about procurement versus AP? And while I think that it's probably on procurement to foster that relationship, there is that perception that anything related to a supplier that goes wrong, and it's usually suppliers shouting about their invoices not being paid, is a procurement problem. And we have a lot of work to do to not necessarily deflect that, because I think we are ultimately accountable for supplier performance, but actually kind of build those relationships with AP, but also the messaging on this is where we support, and these are perhaps some of the things that are out of our control.
That's right. Yeah, and we're helping to automate the self-service around electronic invoice submission, but we may not be involved with all of the exceptions, you know, from a procurement angle, and so a lot of the noise that might come in out of that process still might fall on procurement, even though it might not be, you know, in their remit.
Yeah. How about stakeholders? Are we doing any better when we're kind of strengthening our relationship with our stakeholders, our more immediate stakeholders?
Can I take that, Len?
Sure. So we didn't directly have questions around stakeholders, but as we looked at the investments planned in strategic sourcing, a lot of those came in the form of better managing demand, at actually delivering the value of sourcing, which comes with a very, very strong engagement with stakeholders and helping stakeholders to get the full value out of sourcing. Mm-hmm. So we see quite a bit of that, and I think this links in as well with the development of roadmaps in procurement, which we got some extensive insights on as well, where those roadmaps are really linked to the needs of the stakeholders.
Yeah. You know, talking about the needs of the stakeholders, I think as we talk about CEO relationships, CFO relationships, COO relationships, all the kind of different members of the C-suite that we're trying to influence. Dipan, how do you feel about, like, are we giving the right message to the right person in terms of the value proposition? Or should we be thinking about, I'm talking to a CEO, so my message should be around growth and innovation and ESG. I'm talking to the CFO, then the message should be around finance and margin. COO, perhaps it's around risk. Do you think that we do a good enough job tailoring our message to the right stakeholders when we're talking about what we can do?
I think it's probably mixed. I think we try to tend to tell the same story to the majority of kind of senior stakeholders, and being able to differentiate a little bit can only help us. Certainly, if you're talking to somebody in risk and compliance, it would, you know, be beneficial to talk a little bit about the extensiveness of the supplier risk management programs that you've got, how many templates you're getting, the fact that you're mitigating risk, the fact that you're staying on top of it and things are current, and versus the CFO, who's going to be more concerned with perhaps dollars that are falling to the bottom line, and really being able to differentiate between cost avoidance, cost savings types opportunities, as well as some of the other things. So there's always messaging that needs to happen, and selling a little bit of the value that procurement can bring to the table is extremely critical. And I don't know that procurement historically has been that good at doing that, marketing their services, right? They do great work, but they might not want to go out there and brag about some of the great things.
Expect to be recognized for it just by the nature of the data and your results.
Right. So we got to step up a little bit, but I don't know what you think, Len.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Len.
Yeah, I think communication is kind of one piece of it, but more broadly, I would say it's a partnering conversation. So how does procurement actually partner and engage with its stakeholders? So listening is at least as important as sort of the message that procurement provides.
Well, and we've talked about a lot of different types of internal challenges. Some maybe that the four of us have a slightly different perspective on than the people that participated in the survey that are really sort of true boots on the ground. But when we think about prioritizing them all, because there's a million things that procurement could fragment their attention between, Deepan, what were some of the top internal challenges that emerged when you asked the group in this survey to kind of put some priority order to things?
Yeah, I mean, the first one we heard was limited data and insights and outdated systems, which really isn't surprising. I mean, I think we hear that as a common theme. Most organizations are saying that they need more technology, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And we've done a lot of investing, but there are always new things that are coming out, right? Second, it was around limited spend influence or budget and the lack of stakeholder collaboration and integration within the wider supply chain. So that was an important one. Being able to kind of get ahead into budgetary meetings to be able to influence where that spend is going to go, or at least get enough runway that you can do something and drive the most value out of that spend. So that's an interesting piece of it. As the trust of procurement to be able to drive that value out goes up, I mean, I see that most of our clients are able to get in some of those budgetary meetings and really start early versus coming in at the last minute where they just have to negotiate a contract.
Yeah. Now, if we flip that around and think externally, what were the external challenges that came in at the top of procurement's list?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to kind of what we talked about before. Inflation being kind of the number one, driving cost increases versus cost reductions, right? That, of course, means as costs are increasing, somebody a couple of years down the road should go back and try to renegotiate to bring costs back in line, potentially, and having the continuity of team members to be able to do some of that stuff. The risk of supply disruption and being able to manage the business, critical, gave a lot of stress to procurement organizations over the last couple of years. Demand uncertainty being the third one. So a lot of it was just around availability and making sure that we're converting on the needs of the business so that we don't have a situation where we're not able to sell the things that we're going to provide to the market.
And certainly the goal is to learn from all of this and then better position ourselves for success moving forward. Len, when you think about what can be learned here, as well as what procurement teams are currently thinking about, to what extent are they investing in or working on roadmaps to carry them forward into the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kelly. So, as we've talked about, I think in the last 20 minutes or so, procurement has been in a little bit of a reactive mode, just because it is in the line of fire to try to deal with all the problems that have been going on with the macroeconomic environment and so on. So it's encouraging to hear that there is a lot of work on roadmaps. We did ask a number of questions about that. What we heard from respondents is that most, about 84%, have roadmaps for the next 1 to 3 years.
Okay.
And interestingly, we have a little more than half have roadmaps going out 3 to 5 years. And obviously, where that'll help, we talked a little bit earlier on Phil's question about engagement of, CXOs, engagement of stakeholders. Having those roadmaps will help to align what procurement does and procurement's priorities with what's of value to those stakeholders, and it provides kind of a platform for engaging and setting the expectations for what procurement will do.
Yeah.
And you ask about the capability area. So broadly, what we're seeing is an emphasis within those roadmaps on strategic procurement capabilities. So Deepan talked at length about organizations really, digging in and focusing on sourcing, focusing on supplier management. So we're seeing a lot of focus on those things. We're also seeing a focus on modernization of the technology, and this was, as Deepan said, a little bit surprising, given that we know that a lot of that work has been going on for a while.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot of progress in roadmaps.
Well, it's interesting because you think about it maybe in terms of confidence horizon, right? So you sort of divided it out like the 1 to 3 and then the 3 to 5. It's interesting because I think historically, maybe you'd combine those two into like a relatively short to midterm, right? Whereas now we're thinking, oh gosh, 3 to 5 years, like we're really stretching the imagination to see anything that far out. Was there anything interesting that you noticed when you looked at if there are differences between the priorities for the 1 to 3 and the priorities in the 3 to 5, does anything change, or is it all sort of relatively near term enough that things advance but stay kind of consistent in terms of focus?
Yeah, I would say a few interesting things that may be surprising. So, in the 1 to 3 year time frame, this is really what organizations are already starting to invest in, are already starting to execute against.
Mm.
We are seeing what Phil described as kind of the bread and butter activities. So organizations are really focusing on supplier relationship management, are really focusing on sourcing and value generation, and are continuing to focus on procurement operations. What's interesting in that 1 to 3 year time horizon is, despite all the buzz and high expectations of ESG, we really don't see ESG making it to the top of the list. So the implication is that current investments are not prioritizing that. What we see, though, as you look out further to the kind of the next set of investments and the next generation of capabilities, is sustainable supply chain jumps to the top, and it actually replaces procurement operations as one of the top 3 priorities. We still continue to see a focus on strategic sourcing and value generation and supplier management. But probably those are so important that they'll always remain bread and butter for procurement.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You make the comment about ESG and then sustainability specifically. Do you think it's because it's, quite naturally, easier to think about the vision or the mission than it is to actually operationalize that and start taking action? Or is it just that all of these other internal and external priorities have a way of sort of inserting themselves so that we're not quite getting around to it being a top priority yet?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My take, and Dipan, you may have a perspective on this as well, is that it's more the latter, where procurement is still dealing with a backlog of improvements and building capabilities and delivering value in these other areas, driven by the macroeconomic environment and sort of the supply market dynamics. What we heard about ESG that was interesting is about 84% of companies actually see that their procurement priorities and decisions are fully aligned with ESG already today. So they do appear to be making progress in that regard, but really making a more systemic shift does appear to be further out.
Mm-hmm. Dipan, did you want to add anything?
The only thing I was going to add to the initial question around where we see 3 to 5 years, it was pretty clear that while in the near term, getting more self-service and operational procurement situated, et cetera, organizations wanted to move away from some of those tactical activities into more of the strategic activities. So when they predicted 3 to 5 years out what they would spend the majority of their time on within their organization, it was a lot more around category management, strategic, things that are more strategic in nature versus the exception management, transactional processing, perhaps things that are not even really belonging in the procurement organization, which just kind of got shoved there. So it's cleaning up a little bit, allowing automation from the tools and technologies that they're put in to help them optimize, and then having the time to spend on other things. So that was a pretty clear shift when you looked out a couple of years from now as to where they wanted to go.
Yeah. Phil, let me hand to you.
Yeah, so I'm interested, just another question about the roadmaps. And this is more, how do you build a roadmap? And I'm just wondering, what do you see, and Len, I'll ask this to you first, but Dipan, feel free to jump in as well. How do you see, in terms of the development of a roadmap, the involvement of the C-suite, the key stakeholders, the folks that we're ultimately here as a procurement organization to serve, versus doing it in a bubble, which I think that we, I as a practitioner can certainly be accused of being guilty of that earlier in my career. And we put together these roadmaps and they're not necessarily baked in the reality of what the organization that we worked for actually needs.
Yeah, it's a really good question. In general, a roadmap is a way that organizations can really prioritize and define their investments and capability building and so on. But it's also, for procurement, the mechanism to really align with the broader organization and leadership on the vision, the expectations, the role that procurement will play, the outcomes that the business will get from procurement. And clearly based on some of the statistics that Dipan named in terms of the alignment with the C-suite, procurement has not done enough of that. The opportunity is to do more, to really go out and shape the role of procurement, shape the expectations that the C-suite has of procurement, define what procurement can do, and link that to the set of investments and capabilities and organizational model that procurement has. And that's what a good procurement roadmap should do, in addition to just listing out the initiatives and investments.
Dipan, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we tend to start out looking at the maturity of the organization across kind of the key functional areas of procurement managers. Where are you today? Where do you want to go? And then what are the initiatives that are going to help you to kind of get there? But absolutely aligning with your CFO, CEO that says, hey, this is what we're going to do on a 3-year journey. These are the types of investments we're going to need at a couple of these places. And these are the metrics that they're going to drive. These are the savings that we're going to get from a program like this. So actually having a business case that defines exactly what you're going to get is going to make it easier. So the next budgetary cycle, it's not a trying to sell into it year over year. We see a lot of our clients that are trying to do that at only the budgetary times, finding it very difficult to get the money because something always tends to kind of leapfrog some of the things that procurement wants to do. So the more proactive you can get, the more value you can show, the more detailed that business case is, the more likely procurement's going to be able to get a piece of that budget to do the things they need to do.
And do you find that procurement typically needs to start small, get the small wins, get advocates and kind of build on the investment, or that you see opportunities where, to go and make a pitch for, a full transformation that still may have milestones, but at least that allocates budget throughout it as a
component where there's a technology implementation that there helps you mature your contract, your sourcing, contracting, P2P processes, as well as analytics, et cetera. But perhaps you attack a number of categories that previously were too complicated to go after, or the spend has increased to a level where it now really makes sense to go after them, or the proliferation around suppliers has become so high that now we can go in and actually try some new levers. So let's use those to kind of fund some of the other things that we want to do. And that allows it to be a little bit more net even. We found that CFO, CEOs are a little bit more receptive to that conversation versus, hey, we just need this kind of technology. It's difficult.
We talked about technology and some of the different areas that procurement teams are focused on in terms of technology when they're building their roadmaps and looking more upstream than downstream. I'm interested, Dipan, how are these roadmaps being built so they can be responsive given the pace of change there is around technology, things that it seems on a daily basis, new products, that are integrating generative AI that come along that we hadn't even thought about when we did roadmaps a year ago. Are those providing an opportunity or perhaps I don't want to say fear, but the unknown, like we're not really sure what to do about that and where it all fits yet?
Yeah, I mean, you should look at it regularly to, make best advantage, take advantage of things that might be coming out like Gen AI and new research that might be out. And there's been a lot of movement on benchmarking around sourcing prices over the last couple of years. And there's some really great firms out there that can do very deep benchmarking that previously we didn't have access to. And so taking advantage of some of that stuff in your category management planning and strategic planning could be very beneficial. It could help you drive dollars out. So taking a look, regularly to see how you redo some of the roadmap items makes perfect sense, but sticking to a broad vision that allows you to kind of mature the organization methodically over time is good. And what you don't want to do is every year completely change your priorities so that people don't believe you've got a line of sight into where you're actually going.
Yeah, shiny new toy syndrome. Every time something else comes in to pop into
that doesn't work.
Yeah, I think just to kind of build on what Dipan was saying, that the key point for a roadmap is to get procurement out of that reactive mode. So procurement always has to be dynamic and aligned with the needs of the CXOs and stakeholders, which means keeping an eye on the market and looking for sources of value, but has to be based on a broad framework of what is procurement going to do for the organization, what are the capabilities that are necessary, and that should be what the building blocks in the roadmap are based on.
Yeah, I guess you become reactive again, don't you, if you change it every year to 18 months based on everything around
there's a
you.
balance.
Yeah, defeats the purpose. Now, Dipan, I want to follow up a little bit on that question with, we have this emerging technology, we're having organizations who are doing more investments in technology. Is that changing the allocation of procurement's time and focus because we're now integrating technology more into, the procurement process?
I mean, that's the goal, right? Is to allow technology to do some of the effort. If historically 12 months ago, a year ago, it took you 3 weeks to produce a spend analysis file, but over time, with the integration of those technologies coming into one place, having a standardized taxonomy, you're able to do that every week or every month, or best real time, right? Then all of a sudden it starts to take away from that. And now you can begin to look at the insights. So you can use subsets of that report to send to budget owners to kind of say, here's the spend that you've had so far. And they might not have that visibility, or they might not be able to easily access it. And so now procurement can start to become a little bit more proactive in engaging the stakeholders and show the value that they can bring to the table. So, I think, yes, of course, we would want that technology to drive down transactional processing to save more time for the strategic activities. And the research kind of indicated that that's where folks are trying to go.
Do you see the technology enabling self-sourcing or self-directed sourcing? So, so some of what procurement does today, we actually no longer need to do. And that's not a bad thing because there's now guardrails around how stakeholders can buy to free up the time to then focus on what's more strategic.
Yeah, one of the things Len and I are excited about is kind of the use of generative AI in supplier performance. It's been a huge challenge area for procurement organizations to understand what performance is for suppliers, because there's so many contracts and so many different areas that they're performing, and it's difficult to get some of that information. But if we could start to make use of generative AI to understand how did X supplier do across the 12 contracts that they had within the months of A to Z, all of a sudden that's very valuable. And can get some of that insight, because right now it would take us a long time to be able to go and do that. But with the use of surveys and SLAs that are being more automatically measured, contract management tools that are comparing purchase price variances, et cetera, all of a sudden you can have a little bit more of a report. So there's some things like that I think people are looking out for. And there's a lot of excitement around Gen AI, still nascent, of course, but there's some pretty interesting things that we're doing.
You start to imagine the art of the possible when you apply it to certain use cases. So even on the sales side, you apply it to certain use cases in terms of querying CRM, so customer relationship management databases. Well, apply that to SRM side, and suddenly you're asking questions about all this data that's relatively unstructured or will take you 20 clicks to create a report that you don't really know how to even query the data against. Being able to have converse with that data in that way, I think, provides tremendous opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are extremely bullish on the coming changes from generative AI. And obviously, generative AI is not going to operate on its own as a standalone tool. It's coming on top of orchestration layers and low code, no code, and regular AI machine learning. But what we've done, and this is partly fueled by some of the insights from this survey, partly from just work with our clients, is identified somewhere in the order of 60 use cases in procurement that really spans the gamut of all the functions of procurement, of where are the key applications of generative AI. So we are very excited about that, and certainly that's borne out by the data that we saw in this survey.
Now, Kelly, I'm going to come to you. Sorry, go ahead, Dipan. I'm going to come to you.
I was just going to say back to kind of your emerging question. We saw predictive analytics being pretty high on the list, but also things like digital payment and RPA are still very interesting. And we saw a little bit of a drop off around blockchain. Only 7% kind of identified that as something that they're looking at as an emerging trend. I think it's a little bit less exciting with generative.
I think generative AI has steamrolled blockchain as an interesting and emerging technology, hasn't it? And perhaps because the use cases for, of course, there's very specific use cases that blockchain has been impactful for, but not necessarily at large. So whereas everybody can see the opportunity for generative AI across a much broader use case. The last question, Kelly, before I come to you is Len, for you. Is strategic sourcing still an effective vehicle for procurement in terms of the whole range of the value proposition that we're trying to build?
So the answer is yes, and this was actually a really interesting finding. So obviously, strategic sourcing has been around for a long, long time. We did see, as I mentioned before, that organizations are reporting pretty healthy savings levels. So despite all the flux, all the turmoil in the economy, the inflation and other things, we're seeing about 4.6% cost reduction levels reported, which means that sourcing is working. We also saw that as we asked about the maturity of the different capabilities that procurement has, sourcing and value generation was named as among the top three. So it's working, and organizations feel that they're doing it well. But interestingly, as we talked about the roadmaps, it's also one of the top three in the roadmap going forward for both the 1 to 3 year and the 3 to 5 year. So it just speaks to the fact that organizations continue to value it and seeing it as just core to the mission of procurement. One thing that's just an interesting shift is historically organizations have really thought about sourcing as more of making sure to take the spend to market, compete the spend, negotiate, and so on. And what we're seeing is that there's more of a shift, and Dipan mentioned a few of these points, that organizations are focusing going forward in sourcing to driving budget impacts. So not just get a good price, but make sure that price is actually realized. Then also realizing the value beyond just savings. So not all functions, not all lines of business are looking at as savings as their top priority. And this kind of gets back to aligning procurement's goals and objectives with the stakeholders. So marketing is not talking about savings. Right. Marketing is looking at marketing effectiveness. And then obviously focusing on demand management, which is, again, not a price measure, but really thinking about what do stakeholders need, and how do we make sure that that's rationalized.
Yeah, and so that goes into thinking of it. Procurement's role is across the entire cycle, the make versus buy through to performance management, as opposed to sourcing in its purest sense of, I have a need, I'll go to market, I'll go and sign a contract, and then I'll hand it off. So being involved from end to end in the process, as opposed to it just being event driven, which I think sourcing, if you can point any fingers at sourcing in the past, it's when we think of it as being, we got to churn out RFPs, and then you go on to the next one and go on to the next one without really following it through to the end.
Exactly. This speaks to less of a transactional model and more strategic and business engaged.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about a lot of shifts and changes and trends and roadmaps and long-term planning, but one of the areas of shift where there's been a lot of change that we haven't had an opportunity to talk about yet is talent. So deep in there, I don't think there have ever been so many ways to access skills and category expertise and knowledge, especially with changes in sort of common workforce dynamics. Was there anything of interest in the research that you uncovered around procurement's use of third-party services or outsourcing, either what they're getting in these different capacities or how they're fitting into sort of procurement's value delivery as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't see a huge kind of move or shift over to managed services or outsourcing, but the top three areas that are kind of being utilized today or being considered were really in the third-party risk management space, which there's a lot of volume of work that has to happen around managing the mitigation plans and getting back out to suppliers and keeping records current. And so it totally makes sense that using a third party would help you there. The procure to pay aspect of it, the more transactional component of it, and then certainly outsourcing advisory, if you're actually looking to outsource a part of the organization, engaging external consultants to help you with that, just because you probably don't have a lot of that expertise in-house. So while it wasn't one of the areas that we saw as a number of respondents kind of talking about that this is what they're going to go do, it's on kind of 27% of 1 to 3 year roadmaps and a little bit more, 37% on 3 to 5. So but it'll probably remain like localized in some of those areas that I kind of mentioned. I don't think it'll be everything.
One of the other things that we've touched upon a little bit, but that I wanted to just focus on for a minute, is this idea of ESG. And it's interesting because we all agree, yes, okay, ESG, but depending on where a company is, depending on what industry they're in, depending on which individual you're talking to, you could say ESG and they instantly go, right, environment, or right, diversity and social issues, or in very few cases, people think about governance. And so we've kind of gotten into the habit of, rather than just talking about ESG, trying to dig in, okay, when your company talks about ESG, does that mean scope 3 emissions? Does that mean supplier diversity? Does it mean modern slavery? What are you hearing either broadly about ESG or about some of these projects that are sort of sitting underneath that broad umbrella?
Yeah, I mean, Len mentioned this earlier. ESG is on the top of everybody's minds, I think, across the organization. Given some of the priorities in the environment right now, while it might not be, while there are other things that we need to worry about as a procurement organization, it's certainly kind of looming back there. So while it might not be top of list of priorities right this second, everybody's thinking about it. They're engaging their organizations to make sure they're following where the ESG agenda is going. But what we're seeing in 3 to 5 years, the biggest things that folks are worried about were kind of social impacts, environmental responsibility and sustainability, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in the ESG bucket, those are the 3 that were most commonly cited as areas of focus for organizations. Those could change. 3 to 5 years is a little ways out, but those seem about right based on what we're hearing from our clients. I don't know.
And some amount of it's going to be driven by regulation, right? If you're in financial services, you're looking at this very differently. If you're worried about, right, being publicly listed, and so your scope 3 emissions is a concern. Len, is there anything that you wanted to add on that subject? I know we did touch on it earlier, but just sort of looking at the different lengths of time and where specifically companies are positioning themselves today, maybe to be successful on that slightly longer term perspective.
So clearly part of it is just to make sure that your choices that you make in sourcing, your choices that you make in supplier selection and design of your supply chains aren't taking you away from your ESG goals, and that's where we saw a very positive response that organizations largely feel that what they're doing today is already considering some of those ESG priorities, and that in fact procurement is well aligned with ESG. I think that, as Dipan said, will evolve over time in terms of which specific areas draw the most focus and investment. But broadly, we see organizations moving at this in a measured way while they build and address some of the other value generation and more bread and butter kind of capabilities.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting because, Phil, we talked about the shiny new toy phenomenon, right? And it almost seems like ESG programs are naturally taking a more sustainable course, not sustainable in the sense of environment, but sustainable in the sense of long run. If we can maybe go less big bang, but embed them more in systems and processes and decision-making frameworks, maybe we'll get to that 3 to 5 year window and say, hey, we're already doing it. It's not that we were putting it off this whole time. It's that it was just being folded in as opposed to being managed as a separate initiative.
Right.
Yes, that's absolutely our interpretation, that organizations are conscious of it. It's a priority, but they aren't looking to get there tomorrow. It's going to be a build over time.
Now, this may be... Sorry, go ahead, Dipan.
Yeah, I was going to say, like one of the examples that you mentioned, Kelly, there. So as organizations are building out supplier information management systems, capturing the diversity elements that allow you to kind of categorize suppliers while you're putting in place applications like that, help you down the road to manage your overall portfolio. And within categories, you can now see the diversity, et cetera. So, putting in place those building blocks will allow you to kind of build to it. And over time, it just becomes part of the regular scorecarding.
Yeah, my question was, and Len, I'll ask this to you from we talked about perception of the C-suite earlier. Does this, maybe anecdotally as opposed to in the data, but do you feel that organizationally procurement is seen as a part of the business that can help manage, protect, and be involved, to play an active role in sustainability, diversity, inclusion initiatives, or whether that's something that procurement is saying, hey, look, I can help, putting the hand up and say, this is somewhere where we can make a difference. And that's not necessarily received consistently across, all the different companies that we work with.
So that is a very good question. So certainly a lot of the capabilities and results and impacts of the ESG are going to be influenced by what procurement does. Mm-hmm. And broadly, certainly in my clients, and I assume in yours, Dipan, we see procurement kind of at the center of that. So procurement is influencing, in many cases, driving how ESG plays out with the supply base and kind of supply market. So procurement is absolutely central to this, and procurement in my clients, where procurement is stepping up and focusing on ESG heavily, they are influencing the C-suite in terms of what is our ESG strategy, what should we commit to, how will we get there. So there really is no other function that's going to do that for procurement, and it can't be a grassroots set of actions among all requisitioners or each individual function that uses suppliers.
And it evolved. I mean, Len, a couple of years ago, I think it was more the C-suite coming up with the ESG priorities, and procurement not being necessarily involved in kind of going, hey, how is this going to be possible? What are we going to do here? And then the alignment started happening with the functional areas. And I think they recognized how much procurement was going to have, how important it was going to be to have the appropriate measures created in procurement. And so now they own a lot more of that agenda than they did initially. So it started top down, went down, and kind of grew.
So I have one more follow-up question. Dipan, I'm going to ask this to you, and then I've got a final question I'll ask to both of you just to wrap things up. So we talked a little bit about talent models and outsourcing, third-party service providers. Are you seeing any big shifts in the procurement operating model, the delivery model, in how organizations think about how they're going to staff their procurement team? Or is it pretty much business as usual? There's a well-established and defined best practice, and everyone's kind of building towards that.
Some of the functional areas remain fairly similar to what we've seen in the past. I think with the introduction of many new technologies that are primarily kind of cloud technologies, maintaining them post go live, we're seeing more and more of a move towards managed services for the management of upgrades, enhancements, the taking of upgrades to make sure you're increasing your functionality, right? So there's new capabilities that are being introduced, but a lot of organizations don't actually take advantage of those. And you're kind of losing the value of the license fees that you're paying if you're not actually kind of maturing along with with the application. So we're seeing a little bit more managed services in that space, but some of the functional areas like category management, strategic sourcing continue to remain very important. You're also seeing introduction of new roles like content management. How do you keep the online catalogs and that kind of content up to date? Because the moment people start going into your e-procurement platform and don't see pictures and reviews and content and details, they don't like that shopping environment, and they're more likely to defect from that. So there are introduction of new things like that.
Yeah. So I know that we're coming up on time, and so I have one last question. We've covered a lot of ground, and so Len, I'm going to ask this to you first, but then Dipan, the same question to you. We want to leave people who are listening and watching with a focus on what can they do next. Like, given all this research, the insights that you've got access to, what's something that stands out as a piece of advice or an action that a listener can take today based on it? And Len, I'll pose that to you first.
Sure. So we talked a lot about roadmaps, and clearly that is something that is valuable in order to get out of a reactive mode and to start to influence the C-suite around what is the role that procurement will have going forward. So that's an important action to take, is to really shape what is procurement going to do for the next 1 to 3 to 5 years. As part of that, obviously, based on our findings, system investments are going to be key, and it really shouldn't be a ad hoc or whack-a-mole kind of approach. It should be what is our future modernized system environment that's going to give us all these capabilities. And as part of that, we also talked about generative AI, which will have a role going forward in pretty much every aspect of procurement, and where is that going to fit?
Thanks, and Dipan.
Yeah. So, probably a couple things. I mean, I think in the short term, what we saw was optimism is pretty muted around budgets and kind of ability to grow your teams. But in the 3 to 5 year timeframe, that again goes up, right? So there's an opportunity to kind of continue to invest in the roadmap, as you mentioned, Len, and understand where you're going to go as you get back into a more normal cycle. Only 25% of the companies reported kind of their stakeholders see them positively. There's a huge area to go up. And we're seeing that people are projecting into the 50s, 57% or 56% in the 12 to 18th month range. So, self-service and being able to provide the things that you need to do remains extremely important. And I think it's going to be important to showcase to your stakeholders that you've got something above and beyond what normal folks, what you could do. I would say in terms of functional areas, risk management stood out. A lot of organizations didn't feel like they had the appropriate capabilities to manage the risks and kind of monitor them over the long term. So getting a little bit more of a handle around that, I think, is going to be extremely important. CLM was interesting. I mean, we didn't dive into that as a huge topic, but the capability there is available fairly broadly. And a lot of organizations haven't taken advantage of and have not adopted these. So you've got this imbalance where you've got technology that's kind of far exceeding the capabilities of an organization, which are a little bit lower. So that automatically means at some point that organizations are going to really dive into that. And while a lot of them felt like through the question and answer, they kind of said, well, we're waiting for clause automation and automated kind of negotiations, et cetera. There's a lot of master data management that needs to happen before you can just get to automation there. So building the CLM capabilities and really putting a focus on that, we believe that that's going to be kind of a big area for us as we get into this is going to be a key area as well. So risk management, supplier management, contract management are key areas.
Yeah, and some of those all rely on other parts of the business as well. When you think about CLM, for example, yes, we could put a CLM in isolation for procurement, but the reality is that legal are probably going to want something and sales are going to want something for the other side. And you don't necessarily want to put one platform in on one side of the house and then have another platform on the other. And I think that, you see, because technology is changing so fast, there's almost this fear sometimes of investing in a technology which will be outdated before it's implemented.
Yeah. I mean, one of the stats that we got, Phil, was 41% of respondents said that they don't have a centralized document repository around contract management. I mean, that's an astounding number, given that it's a very basic technology to at least put your contracts into one spot, let alone the clause management, some of the other things that come around it. But that technology is freely available, and I think organizations might be underestimating what it could do for them. We saw this at the beginning of COVID. We got a number of calls from frantic clients like, everybody's not on site. We can't get a hold of our contracts. How do we digitize them as quickly as possible? And how do we mine them to understand when our due dates are coming up and when expiration clauses, and can we get out of some of these contracts? And not having it was a huge challenge. So.
Well, let's wrap things up on that note. I know that we could probably talk for a lot longer with a bunch of more questions, but it's been fascinating to get the value of both your experience and the insights from the research that you've done so far. As you said at the beginning, the research will be out at the end of the year, and we'll make sure that everybody who registered for the event today will get a copy of that research when it's ready. And we'll put it underneath the notes on the@procurement.com. With how to get that as well once it's available. So one last time, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, for being part of the conversation, for listening in. Len and Dipan, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And Kelly, thanks for helping me facilitate.